Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing another top 5 Total War video. This time covering the top 5 poorest factions in a Total War game. So these are the factions that just for whatever reason have the hardest time managing their finances. With that being said, let's jump in now to number 5. Coming in at number 5 is the ODA in Total War Rome 2. Now these guys have received spots on my top 5 worst of lists before, and there's a good reason for that. They're a terrible faction. And it could easily be argued that there are some other factions in Total War Rome 2 that are considered to be the poorest in this game. But I'm going to go with the RDA because I'm taking everything into consideration, not just their ability to make money, but also their ability to manage their troops, which is an important factor. Now, let's start with their faction traits. Balkan Tribe, I reckon, is one of, if not the worst culture trait out of anyone in this campaign. Promise of loot minus 50% mercenary recruitment costs. Now, I have never particularly found mercenary recruitment costs to ever break my bank. I've always found recruiting mercenaries to be relatively cheap with other factions that don't have this trait. So, reducing it by additional 50%, that's great and everything, but when it comes with the next one, then it's like, well, that's far worse. So, rapid campaigns plus 50% mercenary upkeep costs. Now, mercenaries in this game oftentimes cost more in upkeep than they do to recruit. So this one here, for example, recruiting this unit, 178 to recruit and 331 to maintain. So it is cheaper to just have it for the turn and then disband it and then recruit another one the next turn. So that's probably why it's called rapid campaigns. You're basically supposed to recruit a bunch of mercenaries, attack something, disband them, and then go into the next region and then recruit more mercenaries for the next battle. But the problem is that it's a pretty poor way of conducting your warfare, because it's very quick to run out of mercenaries, especially if you're playing on the highest difficulty. You're going to have to fight battles a lot, and when your mercenary pool runs out, you're basically boned. Now that's another thing. Talking about their standing armies. Now, there are some factions in this game that have cheap armies. There are some factions that have really good troops. And the RDA have neither. Their troops are neither expensive nor effective. They're not good in auto-resolve, they're not particularly good in manually resolve, and they're not cheap. So that's why you kind of need to have padding of your mercenaries, except you can't maintain them over the end turns. Puts them in a big risk. Now, another thing is that they don't have any particularly special economic buildings. You know, making money through taxes is the main way that you'll make money, even if you are a pirate in this campaign. And there's nothing particularly special about them, apart from, I mean, they also only start off with a minor settlement. That's a bit of a problem. Now, their other trait is they are pirates, plus 250% income from raiding. Now, that might seem like a lot, but raiding in this game, I've never found it to be particularly effective. Now, let's take this fleet here into consideration. Now, it's only the beginning of the campaign, so don't take too much emphasis on this. But we've got a fleet here of 8 units. It's not a huge fleet. And if we have a look at how much it costs us 656 in upkeep. Alright, so pirates, let's go raiding. Now if you have a look at that, excuse me, that is about, what, 180 worth of income. So that fleet, I mean, going into raiding stance, I believe reduces the upkeep of all ships. So we have a look back into this. And now the navy upkeep is 526. It's still 3 times more expensive to have this fleet than to not have it. So they're not making good money there. So they're as pirates, that's not working out for us. So when you add everything up, they just don't have anything going for them, and that's why I think they deserve a spot on this list. Anyway, let's now move on to number 4. Coming in at number 4 is Russia in Medieval 2 Total War. Now, in Medieval 2, there's a few factions that are particularly poor. Another one might be considered Scotland, but I'm going to argue the point for Russia because based on my playthroughs, I've always found Russia to have the hardest time managing their money, especially at the start, which I guess is the most important time to worry about your finances. Now, in Medieval 2, there are 2 main ways to make copious amounts of cash in the campaign. The first one being trade. Now, there's 2 ways of doing trade. Internal trade, so trading between the settlements that you own, and external trade, which essentially works the same way, but you're trading with cities owned by other factions, which require a trade agreement. Now, Russia has a hard time with both of those situations because the settlements surrounding them here are backwater shitholes. They are low population settlements with poor resources. They just won't generate a whole lot of income. Even though they start off with Novgorod, a very wealthy settlement, part of a wealthy settlement in this game is not just on the settlement itself. The richest settlements in this game are connected to other wealthy settlements. That's why Italy is so valuable, right? Because Novgorod might be, let's just say, better than Genoa. It's not, but let's just say for argument's sake that it is. But the thing that makes Genoa better than it is because it can then trade with Milan and various other Italian settlements down here very easily. The more trade routes and the better the trade routes, the more valuable the city. So because all of the trade routes out here are terrible, it's just not worth a whole lot, especially at the beginning. Later on in the campaign, once Helsinki, Smolensk, Vilnius, Riga, and Moscow have been developed, sure, Novgorod will start swelling up its cash. But we're talking like 50 to 100 turns into the campaign. I'm mainly concerned about the beginning. Now, the other way that a faction can make a lot of money, if you can't make money through taxes and trade, there is another option, and that is through plunder. Plundering settlements is a very viable way to keep your finances in check. It's whenever I do a SYDC that they send it into me with a huge negative deficit in the treasury. The main way that I get them out of that is through plundering rich settlements. Now the thing is with Russia, they don't have any options for that either. Because the thing about these settlements is that the amount that you can get from plundering largely is determined by how many people live there. And there's nobody out here. So sacking Helsinki, Riga, all of these settlements out here isn't going to yield any additional finances. You're not going to sack your own city. That's not going to happen. Now, the closest settlement that they can get to that might actually be of some value is like Thorn down here or Warsaw. It's a pretty long distance to go. And Scotland doesn't have anywhere near as far to go to plunder London or Paris even. If you and plunder everything along the way. There's not much out here in terms of settlements. It's very sparsely populated, and that's largely why the Russians just have a hard time making finances in this game. It's not necessarily the most difficult campaign. I would argue Scotland is more difficult, but managing your finances is just not easy with Russia because there's just not much going out here. Anyway, let's move on to number 3. Coming in at number 3 is Numidia for Rome Total War. Now, once again, this one was particularly difficult to put on this list because it wasn't originally my first choice for Rome Total War's Poorest faction. And I had to look around at all the other factions to, usually around the edges of the map to decide, okay, which one of these are actually the poorest? And I'll just briefly take you through my thought process. So originally I thought, oh yeah, Britons, they start off with a lot of territory, but it's all crap. But then I saw gold and silver here, and I was like, oh, okay. And they can trade internally and they're relatively safe. They don't need a lot of military. All they need to do is protect their assets in Gaul, and you don't have to do that. And it's very difficult for anyone to invade them because no one's got any ports. So Britain's pretty safe. So I thought, Britain's probably not the poorest faction. Because you need to take into consideration that it's not all just about how much revenue you bring in. It's also about outgoings. That's what makes someone rich. It's not just one element. There's all the other elements. It's income and outgoings. So that brings me to the next point, which is Scythia. Scythia probably makes the least amount of money in this game, so I thought about maybe they're the poorest faction. But then I thought, no, they're not, because their outgoings are low as well, because their armies are some of the best early game units. They're good against everything at the beginning of the campaign, having archers and horse archer based armies, and their generals being horse archers, I think. They're really effective on the battlefield, and so effective units, you don't need to have lots of them, which means you can keep your costs down. So even though they don't make much money, they don't need a lot of money, and so they're not particularly poor because of it. Then I thought to Thracia. Thracia needs a lot of money because their armies suck, in my opinion. I'm not a big fan of any of the troops in their roster, but their regions are reasonably wealthy, and they can manage. And that then brought me to Numidia. Now, Numidia doesn't necessarily not make a lot of cash. They have some relatively wealthy settlements. There's, they got 4 settlements to start off with, and It makes a decent amount of cash, looking at that at the beginning. But they also have a lot of enemies, and this is where their expenses start to go up. They're going to be going up against Carthage at the beginning, probably also Rome, maybe even the Iberian tribes pretty early on. And then there's also this territory here in Libya, Siwa, which means that the Egyptians are probably going to come over there pretty early on. Now, Egypt, Carthage, they're some of the strongest factions in the game, and you really can't fight them very well at the start, and so you're just going to get stomped by them. So you have to make some very difficult decisions, and those difficult decisions will generally mean you're not going to make much money. You need to either reduce your expenses or increase your income, and you need a lot of military force as Numidia in order to survive. And so it's difficult going to manage your funds as Numidia, and that's why they're getting the spot on this list. Anyway, let's move on to number 2. Coming in at number 2 is the Ottoman Empire in Empire Total War. So we've already established in the previous video, the top 5 richest factions, that Great Britain is the richest faction in this game. And for the same reasons that they're richest is, well, these guys are the poorest. Because they basically have the opposite playstyle in terms of their economy. Whereas Great Britain is able to make money through trade routes and through feeding vassals, feeding their vassal territory. The Ottoman Empire, whilst it does have vassals, you can't annex your vassals in this. So feeding your territory to the vassals doesn't really make a whole lot of sense at all. Now, because they've got a lot of territory, they also have a pretty high administration cost, which means all of the taxes in all of their settlements is reduced because of it. And most of their settlements are not particularly wealthy, so that really does work against them. Now, another thing, this is the main reason why they have a hard time managing money. Now, whilst the Ottoman Empire might actually be able to make a fair bit of money through their taxes, despite all of those things, the big thing that causes them to lose money is their expenses. Everybody hates the Ottoman Empire in this campaign. You either need to bribe people like crazy to not go to war with you, or you need a massive fuck-off military. And either way, that costs a lot of money. That's something that Great Britain, for example, does not have to do. Now, if you did want to get a big navy to go out and try to compete with Great Britain with the trade routes, for one thing, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage right at the start. So you're going to need a huge initial investment, but you've got to break out of the Mediterranean, which means getting past Gibraltar, which is owned by Spain. And generally speaking, Spain's probably going to declare war on you pretty early on. And even if you do establish a trade route, the trade route comes through here, and it's so easy for anyone to raid it and basically nullify it. It's so easy for them to blockade your ports. Contending with the European powers at the sea is something that the Ottoman Empire has a really tough time doing. So let's just say then, don't bother doing it that way. Instead, go east, something that you're blocking the Europeans from doing. Well, Persia doesn't particularly like you, so you got to fight them. And again, you could bribe them or you could fight them. That's entirely up to you. Either way, it's going to be expensive one way or another. They already start off with naval presence out here and you don't. So getting your ships out here, that could be quite difficult. Or you can go over here and conquer it. But again, the Ottoman Empire is kind of the sick man of Europe, and it really is reflected in this campaign, especially at the start. Their military is inferior to pretty much most other people. And so you just need to have lots and lots of troops, and that costs a lot of money. And so managing finances in the Ottoman Empire is really difficult, and that's why they're getting the number 2 spot on this list. And now let's move on to number 1. Taking the top spot for the poorest faction in a Total War game goes to the Wood Elves in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, I could really go on for quite a long time as to all the little things that make these guys the poorest, but I really don't want this to go on for like half an hour, so I'm just going to list the main points and essentially omit all the tiny little things that contribute to them being the poorest. Now, I want to address as well the other poor factions in this and why they're not as poor as the Wood Elves. So there's the Tomb Kings, right? If you only take one thing into consideration, the overall revenue that you can make per turn, then you'd think that the Tomb Kings are the poorest, because they make the least amount of money. But they also have no expenses, so managing your finances with the Tomb Kings is actually one of the easiest in the campaign, so they're certainly not the poorest, even if they don't make a lot of money outright, because getting rich is not just a matter of revenue, it's also a matter of expenses. The other one is Norska. Norska can't build walls, which means defending your settlements can be difficult, but there's a lot of Norscan settlements in the game, compared to how many Wood Elf settlements there are in the game. And Norska can do a hell of a lot to reduce upkeep cost of their armies, so their armies can be pretty damn cheap. Whereas Wood Elf armies can be very bloody expensive, because the only thing you can do to reduce upkeep costs is by sinking a lot of amber into the Oak of Ages. Now, another thing that I mentioned before, there are very, very few actual Wood Elf settlements in the game. The fewest out of any type. There are 6. There's the 4 in Athelloren, if you don't include the Oak of Ages. Then there's the Gaean Vale, which is Alariel's start position over here. So that one can be captured and built up with 8 build slots. And then there's Orion's camp down here, which is another tree. That's it. Those are the only properly developed Wood Elf settlements in the game. They're the only ones that make a decent amount of money. Now, there is gold and stuff spotted along the map, but the biggest problem with the Wood Elves is that they don't build walls. And no settlement outside of Athelloren can be upgraded beyond tier 1, meaning that they can't defend their regions. And if you can't defend your regions, it means you need more armies. More armies means more expenses. Now, these outposts don't make a lot of money on their own, and so you need assloads of them in order to sort of supplement the income of your tree income. And it can be a bit of a problem managing money that way through taxes. Now, that's not necessarily the primary way that the Wood Elves make money. That's certainly a way to supplement your income, but the primary way is by raising settlements. Raising a tier 5 settlement can yield, more than 100,000 gold, and that's a lot. And if you're good at the game, you can accumulate 1 million gold pretty quickly and easily as the Wood Elves. But, as we've seen, if you ever have a time of peace with the Wood Elves, or a time where you're just not constantly attacking, then you can bleed money very quickly, because come the late campaign, when you start actually going out there actively conquering new territories, you're very unlikely to be able to just rely on your tax income. And if there's ever a point where you're just fighting amongst tier 1 settlements constantly, you're not going to make any money out of that, and you're going to bleed away. And here's the big one. The Wood Elves are probably the weakest faction in the game when it comes to actually assaulting settlements. Every other faction in the game is better at assaulting settlements than the Wood Elves, because the Wood Elves have no artillery. The sort of the one ingredient that you really need for assaulting settlements, to do it quickly, which they need more than anyone to assault settlements quickly, because if you're bleeding money, you can't really justify sitting there besieging a settlement, starving it out. Even if you can, reduce the, the siege holdout time by 4, you still can't waste that amount of time just doing nothing essentially for 4 or 5 turns, starving them out. So, not being good at sieges, having no walls, and having essentially very little income is why the Wood Elves are the poorest faction in a Total War game. I've never had as much trouble managing my finances as when I was playing the Wood Elves. But I do want to state as well that the Wood Elves have an absolute kick-ass field army. They are probably one of the strongest factions in the game on the field. But that's not everything, and even with the strongest field armies, you can still die if you just run out of money, because you've got to pay your troops. Anyway, that's the end of this one. Let me know what you thought, whether you disagree with the list or whether you disagree. And I'll see you in the next one, fuckers.